The road to Havenwood writhed like a startled snake, clinging to hillsides covered in a dense, almost black pine forest. I hadn't seen another car for the last 50 miles, and the feeling that I was driving to the edge of the world grew more palpable with every turn. Los Angeles, with its constant scream of sirens, its blanket of smog, and its millions of desperately lonely souls, was behind me now, a fever dream I was desperate to wake from. Here, the air was so clean it made you dizzy, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. For a young vet like me, tired of patching up spoiled chihuahuas in gleaming Beverly Hills clinics, this place seemed like the promised land. The job offer from a Dr. Anderson had felt like a lifeline. Havenwood was exactly as I'd pictured it. A few streets of tidy houses, a town square with a small town hall and a diner, all of it held in the embrace of an endless forest. The veterinary clinic stood a little ways out of town, a single-story building of dark timber that looked more like a hunting lodge than a medical facility. Dr. Anderson was waiting for me on the porch. He was a man in his 50s, with silver at his temples and deep lines etched around his eyes. The eyes were tired, but they held a genuine kindness. When he shook my hand, I felt the calloused hardness of his palm and the strength in his fingers. The hands of a man who'd done physical labor his whole life. The hands of a surgeon. "Alex," I introduced myself. "Arthur Anderson," he replied with a warm smile. "Glad you finally made it. Come on, I'll show you the place." Inside, the clinic was surprisingly modern. The operating room gleamed with stainless steel. The shelves were stocked with the latest drugs, and in the corner hummed an X-ray machine that would have been the envy of my old clinic in LA. "Not bad for the middle of nowhere, huh?" Anderson chuckled, noticing my surprise. "We value quality out here. Our patients are mostly the serious kind. Cattle, horses, sheepdogs guarding the flocks. Folks here are practical." I soon saw that for myself. Over the course of the day, we treated 3 sheepdogs with various ailments, neutered a couple of young bulls, and set a cow's dislocated hip. The locals who brought in their animals were incredibly friendly. They clapped me on the shoulder, asked about life in the big city, and looked at me with such sincere concern you'd think I was their nephew returning from a long trip. It was strange but nice. The whole town felt like one big, tight-knit family. But by evening I started to notice something. A detail so small, my brain initially refused to register it. In my entire day in this idyllic town, I hadn't seen a single cat. Not one. Not a stray. Not a house cat lounging lazily on a windowsill. Nothing. Our last patient was a burly farmer named Bill, who brought in his German Shepherd Duke for a vaccination. As I administered the shot, I couldn't help myself. "You folks not keep cats around here?" I asked as casually as I could. "Haven't seen one all day." Bill frowned and scratched the back of his neck thoughtfully. "Nope," he drawled, looking off to the side. "They just don't seem to take to the place. Too high-strung, I reckon. Sense something, maybe. Every time someone's brought one in, it's gone in a couple of days. Sprints off like the devil himself is on its tail." I glanced at Dr. Anderson. He was at the sink, washing his hands, and at the sound of our conversation he just grunted non-committally without turning around. His back seemed tense. That evening, as we were locking the clinic with a heavy deadbolt, he suddenly stopped and looked at me with those tired eyes. In the gathering dusk, his face looked stern and ancient. "The most important thing to remember, Alex," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning, "is that we're not just healing animals here. We're keeping the peace." The words hung in the cool evening air. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. As I walked to my small rented house, I couldn't shake the feeling that his words had a second, hidden meaning. Keeping the peace. Whose peace? And what did it need protecting from in this quiet, sleepy town where the biggest problem was a cow's dislocated hip? I looked at the dark windows of the houses. The town seemed to be sleeping, but for the first time, beneath the tranquil silence, I felt a cold, subtle current of unease. And the silence was no longer peaceful. It was waiting. A week went by. I began to settle into the rhythm of Havenwood. The days were filled with work. Visits to farms, routine checkups, the rare emergency case. I got used to the almost over-the-top friendliness of the locals, their silent unity, the way they'd all go quiet when a stranger, a long-haul trucker, walked into the diner. I got used to everything except the absence of cats. That one small inconsistency gnawed at me like a splinter under a fingernail. Every time I saw an empty windowsill or a fence that was practically begging for a cat to sit on it, I felt a faint prickle of anxiety. One afternoon, the clinic door creaked open and an old man appeared on the threshold. He was tall and gaunt, like an old tree, his face a road map of deep wrinkles. He was clutching a large plastic carrier, from which came a low, guttural rumble unlike any cat's meow I'd ever heard. It vibrated in the air, making the hairs on my arms stand up. "Doctor," the old man rasped, setting the carrier on the metal examination table. The sound of plastic on steel was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Need some help." He got into a scrap, the little devil. I moved closer. Through the grate, two eyes the color of molten amber stared back at me. They burned not with animal fear, but with pure concentrated hatred and something else, a startling cold intelligence. "Go ahead and open it, Alex," Dr. Anderson said calmly from behind me. I unlatched the lock and the door swung open. A cat emerged from the carrier, not in a rush, but with a slow, regal dignity. He was enormous, 15 pounds at least, all coiled muscle under a glossy, raven-black coat. One ear was torn nearly to the base, the fresh wound still bleeding. A deep bite mark was visible on his flank. "This is midnight," the old man said. His voice had a strange, almost reverent tone. "Only cat in all of Havenwood." "The only one?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes from the animal. The cat stood on the table, making no attempt to flee, slowly surveying the room with his mesmerizing eyes. "That's right," the old man grunted. "Even the sheepdogs give him a wide berth. He's kind of a guardian around here." A guardian. The word echoed in my head, reminding me of Anderson's phrase. Just then, the doctor approached the table, and something strange happened. The cat, who had been glacially calm, suddenly transformed. The fur on his back bristled, turning him into a black demon. The low rumble escalated into a menacing hiss that sounded like tearing fabric. And he wasn't looking at me or the old man. His gaze was locked on Dr. Anderson. It wasn't the look of an animal at a human, but of an equal at an equal, the look of an old, sworn enemy. Anderson froze for a moment. His kind, tired face changed. His features sharpened, becoming hard, almost predatory. The mask of the kindly country doctor slipped, and for a second I saw something primal and dangerous underneath. Then he blinked, and the illusion was gone. He calmly turned to a cabinet and pulled out a pair of thick leather gloves. "Well, Guardian," his voice was even, but there was a new, steely edge to it. "Let's have a look at those war wounds." He reached for the cat. Midnight didn't back down. He crouched, ready to spring, and hissed louder, baring an impressive set of fangs. I instinctively recoiled. but Anderson moved with astonishing speed and precision. His hand shot out, not to grab the cat, but to place his palm on its head, gently but with an air of absolute authority. The cat froze as if stunned by the audacity. For a second they were locked in place, staring into each other's eyes. Man and beast, two poles of some force I couldn't comprehend. Then Midnight, as if conceding defeat in this duel of wills, stopped hissing, though his body remained tense as a coiled spring. While Anderson treated the wounds, I stood there, rooted to the spot. The atmosphere in the room was electric. This wasn't just a veterinary procedure. It was a ritual, ancient and strange. When it was all over, the old man paid in silence, put the cat back in the carrier, and left with a nod. I looked at Anderson. He was pulling off the gloves and his hands were trembling slightly. "Is he really the only cat in town?" I asked. Anderson sighed, and the familiar weariness returned to his face. "Yes," he said curtly. "Midnight is the exception that proves the rule. Some things, Alex, are better left undisturbed, and some things are better left alone." He looked at the closed door, and I had the feeling he wasn't just talking about the cat. Life in Havenwood was governed by its own unwritten laws. One of them, I soon discovered, was the lunar cycle. A couple of weeks after Midnight's visit, Dr. Anderson announced a new rule, one that directly involved me. "Alex, we're going to need to close the clinic for 2 or 3 days every month," he said one morning, studying a wall calendar. "Why?" I asked, surprised. "Inventory or something?" "Something like that," he said vaguely, avoiding my eyes. "Supply runs to the city. Sometimes I have conferences. Just think of it as extra time off. Relax. Take a walk in the woods. The town gets quiet on those days anyway. Everyone stays home." His explanation was flimsy. What conferences could there be in this backwater? And why did the whole town get quiet on those specific days? I felt him building another wall around himself and the town's secrets, but I decided not to push. I knew I wouldn't get a straight answer. My first forced day off arrived. The town truly did seem dead. The blinds on the houses were all drawn, and there wasn't a soul on the streets. Even the diner, the usual hub of social life, was empty. The silence was oppressive. That evening, I sat by the window of my small rented apartment on the second floor of an old building at the edge of town. Outside, the sky was turning an inky black. It was a clear night, and a huge, almost full moon was slowly rising over the jagged tops of the pines. Its light wasn't warm or romantic. It was cold, spectral, and silver, bathing the empty streets in a deathly glow that sparked a primal, nameless anxiety. I was about to draw the curtains when I noticed movement below. A familiar silhouette was slinking along the street, keeping to the shadows of the buildings. Black, low to the ground, fluid. Midnight, the guardian cat. He wasn't moving like a normal cat, wandering aimlessly or looking for food. He moved with a clear, deliberate purpose, his back arched and his tail held high. His gait was predatory and focused. He was patrolling his territory. Curiosity, mixed with the unease that had been my constant companion since day one, overrode my common sense. What could the only cat in town be doing at night when every other living soul was hiding indoors? Without a second thought, I threw on a jacket, slipped on my sneakers, and crept out of the house. The cold night air hit my face. I kept my distance, about 30 yards back, using the sharp black shadows cast by the moonlight to stay hidden. Midnight walked with confidence, never once looking back, as if he knew no one would dare follow. He passed the town square, slipped past the dark windows of the town hall, and turned onto the road leading out of town. The same road I'd driven in on. My heart started to pound. Where was he taking me? The thought of me, a grown man, stalking a cat through a deserted town at night would have been absurd anywhere else. But here, in Havenwood, where the normal laws of logic seemed to bend, it felt like the only sane thing to do. He walked for about half a mile before stopping. I peered out from behind a large boulder on the side of the road and saw where he had led me. Straight to the veterinary clinic. My clinic. My heart dropped into my stomach. A dim, yellowish light glowed in Anderson's office window. But he'd said he was at a conference. The front door was locked with the same heavy deadbolt we used every night. I stared at the building, lost, not knowing what to do. And then Midnight, who was standing by the wall, lifted his head and looked directly at me. In the moonlight, his eyes glowed like two hot coals. He let out a short, demanding meow. Then he walked over to the side of the building, where one of the supply room windows was propped open a few inches, and meowed again, looking from me to the window. There was no doubt about it. He wasn't just on a walk. He had led me here, and he was inviting me in. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Approaching the clinic, knowing Anderson had lied to me, was terrifying. But my curiosity and Midnight's insistent gaze were stronger. I tiptoed across the gravel lot and went to the open window. It was about 5 feet off the ground. Using an old crate for a boost, I managed to pull myself up and peer inside. The supply room. Shelves of cleaning supplies and old equipment. Midnight sat below, waiting patiently. I made my decision. Squeezing through the narrow gap wasn't easy. I scraped my shoulder and dirtied my jacket. I dropped onto the cold concrete floor and froze, listening. From deep within the building, from the direction of the operating room, I could hear muffled sounds. I couldn't make them out at first. They weren't voices. They were moans. The screech of metal and something that sounded like choked screams. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Midnight stepped forward confidently, his black tail held straight up like an antenna. He led me through the dark hallway, past the exam rooms, straight to an unremarkable door at the far end that I'd always assumed was a storage closet. Now I could see that it was lined with a thick layer of soundproofing. The sounds were coming from behind it. The cat stopped at the door and looked at me, meowing once more, softly. The door wasn't locked. With a trembling hand, I turned the cold metal knob and pulled. Behind the door were steep concrete steps leading down into a basement I never knew existed. The smell hit me immediately. An acrid cocktail of antiseptics, sweat, fear, and something metallic like fresh blood. The moans and screams grew louder, interspersed with a guttural snarling that made the hair on my neck stand on end. I crept down the stairs and froze on the threshold, and my world split in two, before and after. Before me was a huge room flooded with the harsh light of fluorescent lamps. It was sterilely clean, like an operating room, but its purpose was monstrous. Along the walls, in 2 rows, stood 25 heavy metal beds, like something from a horror film. And on each one, strapped down with wide leather restraints at the wrists, ankles, and torso, was a person. I recognized them. There was Bill, the farmer who'd told me about the cats. Over there was Mrs. Davis, the quiet librarian. Even the town sheriff, a heavy-set man named Carter, was strapped to a bed, his face a mask of unbearable pain. They writhed and thrashed against their bonds, their bodies arching. Moving between the beds like reapers on a hellish field were 2 figures. The first was Dr. Anderson. Sweat poured from his brow, his shirt soaked through. He moved from one bed to the next, giving injections from large syringes filled with a thick, oily, dark liquid. Assisting him was an enormous man I had never seen before. He had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as wide as a doorway, a thick black beard, and a mane of tangled hair. He looked like a grizzly bear that had decided to walk on its hind legs. He moved with a ponderous animal grace, checking restraints and holding down those who struggled the most. Suddenly, one of the patients, a young man of about 16 whom I didn't know, began to convulse violently. His scream shifted into an animalistic, throaty roar. Before my horrified, paralyzed eyes, his body began to change. His skin rippled and bulged, his joints dislocated with a sickening crunch. The nails on his fingers lengthened, blackened, and sharpened into claws. His face elongated, his jaw jutting forward into a lupine snout as his skin began to sprout coarse, dark fur. "George, hold him!" Anderson cried out desperately. The hairy giant, George, immediately threw himself at the bed. He used his immense weight to pin down the transforming body, which snarled and bucked with inhuman strength. Anderson stumbled over and frantically plunged the needle of a syringe directly into the monster's neck. The transformation slowed, then froze halfway. The creature on the bed was neither man nor beast, a nightmarish hybrid, choking in agony. And in that moment, in the relative quiet that followed, Midnight, who had been standing at my feet the whole time, let out a loud, furious hiss. Anderson and George whirled around. Their eyes shot to the stairs, and they saw me, frozen in the doorway, my face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. For one endless second, the world stopped. 25 pairs of eyes, full of pain and madness, stared at me. Anderson's gaze filled with despair and shock, and the heavy, unreadable stare of the bear-like giant George. Then the self-preservation instinct, the oldest and most powerful of them all, took over. I spun around and bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Behind me, I heard a heavy, thunderous stomping. George was coming after me. "Stop! George, don't touch him! Don't hurt him!" Anderson's shout reached me, but I wasn't listening. I flew out of the basement, tore down the hall, and without a second thought launched myself out the same window I'd climbed through. I landed hard on the gravel, bruising my knee, and scrambled to my feet to run, to escape into the saving darkness of the forest. But I didn't make it 2 steps. A powerful hand, like a bear's paw, clamped down on the collar of my jacket. I was lifted off the ground like a kitten, and for a moment I dangled in the air, my feet kicking uselessly. Then I was set down, gently, almost carefully. I turned. George stood over me, looming like a mountain. His face was unreadable, but there was no malice in his eyes. He just held my shoulder in his massive hand and silently led me back into the clinic through the main entrance. Anderson was waiting for us inside. He looked defeated, as if he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. He led me into his office and sat me down in a visitor's chair. I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. "I didn't want you to find out," he began, his voice quiet and cracked. "I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. But you saw it all for yourself." He took a deep breath, gathering his strength. "This town, Alex, is filled with werewolves, almost everyone. Farmer Bill, Sheriff Carter, Mrs. Davis, all of them. It's not a disease you can catch. It's an ancient curse that runs in their bloodlines. For decades, for centuries, on the full moon they would change in the woods. They lost loved ones, killed stray travelers, lived in constant fear and shame." He nodded at George, who stood silently by the door, his hands clasped behind his back. And then he came along. George is one of the oldest in our community. When he was a boy, the elders tried a desperate measure. They forced the children to ingest small, constant doses of silver, hoping to burn out the curse. Most of the children died horribly. But George survived. He doesn't fully change, but he never fully became human again either. He's stuck between worlds. He's stronger and tougher than any man, but the shadow of the wolf is always with him. My father, who was the vet here before me, Anderson continued, was a genius. For decades he studied George's blood, and he created this. He gestured toward the basement. A suppressant. It's not a cure, Alex. It's a crutch. A serum based on the unique antibodies in George's blood that helps them endure the transformation without losing their minds, without giving in to the beast's rage. It keeps the beast on a leash. I listened, my horror slowly giving way to a stunned understanding. It was insane, but it explained everything. The town's solidarity, the lack of outsiders, the strange vacations, the phrase about keeping the peace. They weren't monsters in a torture chamber. They were patients in a hospital, going through a hellish procedure to protect themselves and the outside world. George, standing by the door, gave me a grim look and slowly drew his thumb across his throat. The gesture was unmistakable. I went cold. He won't touch you, Anderson said wearily, seeing my fear. That's just his peculiar sense of humor. He's just making it clear that our secret has to die with you. Please, Alex, don't judge them. They aren't monsters. They're sick people, fighting desperately for the right to live normal lives, for the right not to be monsters. I sat in silence, processing it all. Across from me sat not a sinister torturer, but a tormented doctor, carrying the fate of an entire town on his shoulders. I looked at George, and in his eyes I saw not a threat, but an immeasurable weariness and responsibility. I won't say anything, I finally managed to choke out. Anderson closed his eyes in relief. Thank you. Go home, Alex. Try to get some sleep. As I walked through the empty streets toward my house, the world was no longer the same. Havenwood had shown me its dark, bleeding soul, and to my own surprise, I felt no desire to run. I didn't leave my house for the next 2 days. I just sat, staring blankly at the wall, trying to fit the monstrous truth into my head. Werewolves. A serum. A basement full of pain. It all felt like a delusion, a nightmare I was about to wake up from. But I didn't wake up. Every detail, the strange behavior of the residents, the absence of cats, midnight Anderson's words, clicked into place, forming a complete and terrifying picture. Fear battled with my professional curiosity as a vet and a strange, budding sense of duty. On the third day, the next night of the full moon, I couldn't sit still any longer. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else. I had to go back, not as a spy, but as a doctor. I arrived at the clinic an hour before sunset. Anderson and George were already in the basement, preparing for the night ahead. Seeing me, Anderson froze, but I saw no reproach in his eyes, only surprise and a flicker of hope. I came to help, I said simply. George gave me a long look and then nodded silently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and I stayed. The scene was the same as the first night, but now my eyes saw it differently. I saw not monsters, but miserable, frightened people, my neighbors and patients. I helped George check the leather restraints, which now seemed not like instruments of torture, but tools of salvation. I helped Anderson lay out sterile syringes and ampules of the dark serum. It was that night I properly met Kevin. He was the same kid whose interrupted transformation I had witnessed. By day, he was a skinny, slightly awkward teenager of about 16 with a mop of red hair and freckles. He looked terrified. You're the new doctor?" he asked, his voice trembling as I helped him onto his cot. "Yeah, my name's Alex." "Kevin," he whispered. He avoided my eyes. "I'm scared. This is my first full change. Dr. Anderson says the serum will help, but it's still scary. They say it's like being burned alive from the inside out." I didn't know what to say. "In our family, the curse shows up after 16, he continued, as if he needed to get it out. "It's different for everyone, but that's the usual age. It's why there are no older teenagers in town. The ones who have a chance, they get sent away to live with distant relatives in other states, until it's clear if they inherited this or not. The lucky ones don't come back. And people like me, we come back here, to family." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. This town wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a quarantine, a hospice for those unlucky enough to be born with the curse. Night fell. I went from bed to bed, helping people lie down, tightening the straps. I saw in their eyes not malice, but a primal animal terror of what was about to happen to their own bodies. They thanked me in quiet, choked voices. As the moon's disk cleared the treetops, the basement filled with a cacophony of sound. Screams of agony, the crunching of bone, snarling. It was horrific. But now, knowing the truth, I looked upon their torment and felt, instead of panic, only an immense all-consuming pity and compassion. I watched Anderson and George work at the limits of their endurance, moving from one convulsing body to the next, injecting the life-saving serum, whispering words of encouragement to those who were still conscious. That night, I stopped being an outsider. I became a part of this nightmare, a part of this desperate struggle for humanity. And as dawn approached and the exhausted people fell silent, sinking into a heavy sleep, I knew I had found my place. Not in the idyllic, peaceful Havenwood, but in its bloody, suffering underbelly. A month passed. My life fell into a new, strange routine. By day, I was a regular vet, treating dogs and cows. For 3 nights a month, I descended into the basement, becoming an assistant to Anderson and George. The townspeople had finally, truly accepted me. Their friendliness was no longer forced. It now held warmth and gratitude. I had become part of their secret, tormented family. I became particularly close with Kevin. After his first transformation, he was calmer. He'd often stop by the clinic after school, pretending to check on his dog, but really just to talk. He was a smart, observant kid who dreamed of being an engineer and building bridges, a bitter irony for someone trapped in this town. One day, while helping me clean some instruments, he lowered his voice. "There's a stranger in town. Been hanging around for a couple of days. Staying at the motel on the highway. Asking weird questions at the diner. About the town's history, why so few people live here." That put me on edge. Strangers were rare in Havenwood, and they never stayed long. A few days later, I ran into him myself. I was having lunch at the diner when a middle-aged man in a touristy windbreaker and hiking boots sat down at my table without an invitation. He had a nondescript face, but sharp, observant eyes that took in everything, and an unpleasant, oily smile. "Mind if I join you? Place is packed," he said, though a couple of tables were free. "Name's Bob." "Alex," I replied curtly. "You're not from around here either, are you, Doc?" His smile widened. "This town has fascinated me for a while. Unique place. So remote. But the standard of living seems decent, and the people, so close-knit." We made small talk. The weather, fishing, my job. He seemed like a normal, curious tourist, But at the end of the conversation, as he was getting up to leave, Bob leaned in and whispered, so only I could hear, "I know about the werewolves." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. A chill shot down my spine. I forced a look of utter confusion onto my face and chuckled. "I'm sorry, what? You must have been watching too many horror movies." "Don't play dumb, Doctor." His smile vanished, his eyes turning cold and sharp as ice chips. "I'm a journalist, and I've been digging into this for 5 years." He opened his satchel and showed me the edge of a worn file folder. I caught a glimpse of newspaper clippings about missing hikers in the area over the last 50 years, reports of brutal attacks by unknown animals, maps with marked territories, blurry photos of something large and dark taken in the woods. All the trails lead here to Havenwood. Too many coincidences, too many secrets. I've almost got all the proof I need, and soon the whole world is going to know the truth about this cursed little town. It's going to be the story of the century. He winked and left me sitting there, stunned. I immediately rushed to the clinic and told Anderson and George everything. Anderson's face went ashen. George, listening, scowled, his face becoming a granite cliff. "I'll keep an eye on him," he rumbled, his voice laced with an undisguised threat. The next full moon was approaching. The tension in town was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone knew about Bob, and fear hung in the air. That evening, as the residents began to gather in the basement, Kevin didn't show up at his usual time. A knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. George and I ran outside to look for him. We found him halfway to the clinic. The kid was staggering like he was drunk, his eyes wide with terror. I saw Bob at the diner," he stammered, his words slurring. "He started talking about monsters again, showed me those papers, said he knew how to help me, how to cure me. I tried to leave, but he grabbed me and injected me with something in my neck." George swept the weakening boy into his arms as if he weighed nothing, and we raced him to the basement. The moon was already rising. Down below, the agony was already beginning. We barely had time to strap Kevin to his cot. What followed was a night of pure horror. The others were screaming, but something was terribly wrong with Kevin. His transformation began almost instantly without the prolonged agony. He thrashed against the restraints with an inhuman, insane force that made the metal bed frame creak and bend. His screams weren't filled with pain like the others. They were filled with blind, primal rage. Anderson, pale as a sheet, ran over and injected him with the standard dose of suppressant. It had no effect. None at all. It was like injecting him with water. The boy's body continued to change monstrously, swelling in size. The fur that covered him wasn't the usual dark brown, but black, like midnight's coat. His eyes burned with a hellish red light. "It was Bob," I shouted over the roaring. "It's whatever he injected him with. He did something to him." Anderson stumbled back from the bed, his face a mask of horror. "Aconite," he whispered, and I could barely hear him. "Wolfsbane. I read about it in my father's old books. It's a poison. The old legends were lies. It doesn't cure or repel. It drives a werewolf insane, shatters the barrier between man and beast, and unleashes a pure, uncontrollable monster." He yelled, "George, we have to contain him. Double the restraints." But it was too late. With a deafening crack like a rifle shot, the thick leather straps, strong enough to hold a bull, snapped one after another. The thing that had been Kevin an hour ago rose from the bed to its full, towering height. It was enormous, a head taller than George, lean and muscular like a giant wolf from a nightmare. It stood on its hind legs, saliva dripping from its fanged maw. The wolfsbane didn't just drive him mad, it amplified him, George growled, positioning himself between the monster and the other people strapped to their cots. His face was the very definition of a berserker's rage. "Arthur, get the tranquilizer rifle, now!" Anderson was already running to the gun locker in the corner. The other werewolves, even in the throes of their own transformations, cringed in terror, sensing the new deadly threat. George, not a full werewolf but possessing a shadow of its power, did what no sane man would have done. He charged the beast head-on. A brutal primal battle between two titans began. The room filled with roars and snarls. George was incredibly strong, but the wolfsbane-fueled werewolf was the embodiment of pure madness and rage. They rolled across the floor, knocking over medical carts. At one point, George twisted, and with a sickening crack, broke the werewolf's front leg. It howled in pain and fury. The sound made me freeze. Using its momentary advantage, the werewolf flung George aside like a rag doll. The giant slammed into a wall and slid to the floor, stunned. The beast, no longer paying any attention to the basement's other occupants, limped on its broken leg toward the exit. It smashed the massive, soundproofed door off its hinges with a single blow and disappeared with a roar into the hallway. A second later, we heard the clinic's front door splinter into pieces. "He's loose in the town!" Anderson screamed in horror, rushing to the injured George. George struggled to his feet, rubbing his bruised head. A cold fire burned in his eyes. "Arthur, look after the others. I'll try to stop him." "I'm with you," I said, my voice surprisingly steady as I took the rifle from Anderson. It only had 3 darts. Together, George, who didn't even seem to notice the bleeding gash on his forehead, and I plunged into the night in pursuit of the rampaging monster. We ran out of the clinic into the cold, moon-drenched night. The werewolf wasn't just running. It was moving with purpose, leaving a trail of bloody paw prints from its broken leg. Its path led straight to the heart of town, the central square. I couldn't imagine why, but I soon had my answer. As we rounded the corner of the town hall, breathless, we were met with a bizarre and horrifying scene. In the center of the square, where children played during the day, a large bonfire was blazing. Beside it stood Bob. He was in a state of euphoria. A video camera was set up on a tripod nearby, and he was excitedly muttering into it, watching as the werewolf that was once Kevin tore into the carcass of a deer that the journalist had obviously dragged there as bait. Every so often, Bob would toss handfuls of some dried herb into the fire, sending up plumes of thick, cloying smoke with a sickly sweet smell. The scent was so strong it made my own head spin. George snarled beside me and shook his head, fighting off its effects. "I knew it. I knew it. This is incredible. A pure, unadulterated specimen," Bob exclaimed into his camera, completely ignoring us. "What are you doing? Are you insane?" I yelled, raising the rifle. Bob finally noticed us. His face showed not panic, but triumph. "Ah, Doctor. I knew you were in on it. Don't interfere. I'm just proving my theory. This is the scoop of the century." At that moment, George, who had circled around us, crept up behind Bob. In his hands was a large tin can that had been sitting near the fire. With one motion, he dumped its contents all over Bob. The journalist was drenched head to toe in a thick, oily liquid that reeked of blood and the same intoxicating herbs. What are you doing?" Bob shrieked, trying to wipe himself off, his face a mask of confusion and terror. "Anyone who threatens my family," George said, his voice low and severe as a death sentence, becomes the bait. The werewolf, which had been consumed by the deer carcass, suddenly went still. It slowly raised its monstrous head and sniffed, drawing the air in through its flared nostrils. Its crazed red eyes snapped away from the deer and focused on Bob. The beast let out a low, hungry growl. With a piercing scream of terror, Bob bolted, running toward the dark side streets. "He's going to die!" I shouted at George, lowering the rifle in shock. I looked at the giant's rage-contorted face and saw not a protector, but a beast no better than the one hunting its prey. We were supposed to stop it, not feed the idiot to it. George, decide what you are, a man or a monster. My words seemed to hit their mark. The rage on George's face flickered, replaced for an instant by confusion. He froze, as if I'd struck him. Then, with a furious roar of his own, he charged, not after Bob, but after the werewolf, trying to intercept it. Bob, fleeing, managed to pull a pistol from his waistband. A shot rang out. A silver bullet, glinting in the moonlight, struck the beast in the shoulder, but it only enraged it further. It howled, and its speed only increased. I raised my rifle and fired my 3 shots, all of them missing wide. I swore loudly. George tried to tackle the beast, but the maddened werewolf swatted him aside with one powerful swipe of its paw. In a few giant leaps, it caught up to the screaming journalist. A blood-curdling scream tore through the night, then was cut off with a sickening wet crunch. The beast, snatching the limp body in its jaws, dragged it into the darkness of the woods, leaving us alone in the square. The air still smelled of smoke, blood, and madness. At dawn, as the cruel moonlight gave way to the soft gray light of morning, we went into the woods. We, meaning me, George, and Dr. Anderson, who had left the other patients in the care of their recovered relatives. We didn't have to look for long. In a small clearing amid trampled ferns, we found what was left of Bob. The scene was monstrous. The hunter's toll had been collected. Nearby, curled up under the roots of an old oak tree, slept a naked, gaunt, and exhausted Kevin. He was covered in dirt and caked blood, his own and someone else's. A ragged wound from the silver bullet was visible on his shoulder. Anderson carefully approached and covered him with his coat, and then George gently lifted him into his arms and carried him back to the clinic. I just stood there, staring at Bob's remains, nauseated by the horror and the wrongness of it all. George returned, silently took the shovel he had brought with him, and began to dig a shallow grave. No words, no ceremony, just erasing the evidence. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the town. For the next few days, George was grim and lost in thought, a walking thundercloud. He barely spoke, and even his massive frame seemed stooped under an invisible weight. "It's not your fault, George," Anderson told him one evening as we sat in his office. "The man brought it on himself. He played with fire. You were protecting us." But George just shook his massive head. "I gave in to the rage, Arthur," he said, his voice hollow, and for the first time I heard a note of despair. "I acted like a beast. I used him as bait. And what Alex said, he was right. I'm stuck between worlds, and I almost chose the worst one. My method, the serum from my blood. It's a dead end. It's a crutch that sometimes breaks. It only ever worked on me, and even then, not completely. There has to be another way, a real way." A few days later, George packed a small rucksack. He found Anderson and me as we were closing the clinic. "I'm leaving," he said simply. "Where?" Anderson asked, his voice filled with alarm. "I don't know. Far away. I've heard stories. about others like us. Old bloodlines in Europe, hermits in the northern mountains. I have to find answers. A real cure, not this stopgap measure. I have to understand why the silver did this to me. Maybe the answer isn't in my blood, but in what the curse and the metal did to it. I have to try. He gave us a long, serious look. Look after my people. Our family. You, Arthur, you're their doctor. And you, Alex. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. You're their conscience now. Don't let them become monsters. He turned and walked down the road leading out of town, never looking back. His massive figure slowly dissolved into the gathering twilight until it was gone completely. The pack leader had left his pack to find its salvation. I stayed in Havenwood. I was no longer just a vet who was tired of the big city. I had become the keeper of a secret, a helper and a friend to an entire town afflicted by an ancient curse. Looking at the darkening windows of the clinic, beneath which my patients slept in their sterile basement, I understood that my real work here was just beginning. I didn't know if George would ever come home, but I knew one thing for sure. The next full moon was only 3 weeks away, and the cycle had to continue.